Thank you for coming to hear my talk. So I'm going to show you a portrait of all the known planets in the universe 20 years ago. And so back then there were 9 planets in our solar system. Since then we've lost one, unfortunately, Pluto. But at that time, extrasolar planets, finding planets orbiting other stars other than our sun, was kind of a fairy tale. It seemed to be a fantasy because planets are so much smaller and so much dimmer than the stars that they orbit. It was a seemingly impossible task to find planets like the Earth. But in the 20 years since, we've made a lot of progress. So here's a somewhat dated, 3-year-old XKCD comic showing all the known planets at that time, 786 of them, and they're all drawn to scale. And what I wish to draw your attention to is that our planets in our solar system are in this very small gray box. And that's not too surprising given that bigger planets are easier to find than smaller planets. But certainly in the initial years of finding planets orbiting other stars, most of the planets that we discovered were at least as large or more massive than Jupiter itself. So it's only been in the last several years that we've started reaching down to smaller planets. But even 20 years ago, astronomers and astrophysicists were wondering what it would take to reach out and discover our nearest neighbors. And so there was a workshop held in May of 1995 called Exploring Nearby Planetary Systems, where a group got together, had a workshop, and then submitted a report to NASA. And they charted out a path towards eventually obtaining a detailed image of an Earth analog way out in the future. But in the meantime, they predicted that we would be able to find and image accretion disks where planets are forming in planetary nurseries around very young stars, and that has happened. That we would image Jupiter somewhere around 2006, and essentially that kind of thing has happened, and that we would use spectroscopy to start studying the atmospheres of extrasolar planets. And indeed, that has happened kind of along the timeline that's projected here. One thing this report did not do was it did not recommend that we pursue transit photometry as a method by which to find planets. In fact, the prospects for transit photometry were rather pessimistic based on the report from this workshop. Well, here are all of the exoplanet discoveries over time with respect to the date, the discovery year that they were made, and with respect to the radius of the planet. Now, this covers all of the methodologies that have resulted in almost all of the planets, including radial velocity, which was how the first planet was found, 51 peg, B, from the wobble method. So you look at the changes in the radial velocity, or the velocity of a star along the line of sight, as it's dragged around in its orbit about the barycenter of its system by its planets. The XNIPS group also talked about astrometry, and we have one planet discovered by astrometry to date. Indeed, back in 1989, a curious object was found by Dave Latham using radial velocity, but it wasn't clear at that point in time whether it really was a planet. And since then, the consensus is that it probably is a planet. But you can see that once we got started in 1995, that people pushed down the sensitivity to find smaller and smaller planets over time. And we've got planets via imaging, microlensing, which is a relativistic effect where you find a planet through its perturbation of the Einstein ring as the star it's orbiting is creating a lens for a source star far distant, and also through other transit investigations. So, in fact, the first planet to be discovered to transit across the face of its star was HD 209458b. That was in the year 2000, and in some sense that's not an accident for the Kepler mission, which it took a number of years for us to convince our colleagues that this was actually an achievable mission. Our principal science investigator, Bill Barucki, submitted proposals in 92, 94, 96, 98, and in the year 2000, the same year that HD 209458b was discovered, showing that all of these planets, about 20 of them that had been discovered up to that point, were really planets. They weren't some other kind of phenomena. Kepler was selected for launch. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. But it's very interesting to see how this is all shaked out, in the sense that transits, which were the underdog back in the mid-90s, nobody wanted to do Kepler, it seemed, other than the team that was working on it, has resulted in over 1,000 planets out of the roughly 1,900 planets that have been discovered heretofore. And in fact, most of the planets that we've discovered with Kepler are smaller than Neptune. And more of them are smaller than twice the size of the Earth than any others. So it's turned out rather interestingly. Now, over 500 of these planets have been discovered by radial velocity, and as you saw in the last graph, people have worked really hard to push down the sensitivities of radial velocity instrumentation especially to reach down to smaller and smaller planets. And with respect to the imaging, that's just something that's getting started, and it's very exciting. So we're starting to fill in parameter space in terms of long orbital periods, short orbital periods, and medium-sized orbital periods. Not to mention the fact that aside from these 1,900 planets, there are over 4,600 planet candidates that have been identified by Kepler. And 80 to 90% of those we believe are real planets, but it takes a lot of time and follow-up work to confirm or validate planet candidates. I want to talk to you now about what enabled Kepler to be selected. And it really was a confluence of different things that had to happen. We had to demonstrate that we could reach a photometric precision with the instrument of about 20 parts per million, including all the noise sources, including stellar variability. And that required the advent of backside illuminated CCDs, similar to the chips you find in your cell phones or in your digital cameras. And we demonstrated in the lab that we could achieve about 10 parts per million from the instrument itself. We required sophisticated algorithms in order to solve the challenges posed by the image processing and the signal processing that face Kepler to find these very weak signals against the background noise. So here's the focal plane. You can see that's kind of the crown jewel of the Kepler instrument. Here's a flow diagram for the search algorithm that we employ to do a joint noise characterization signal detection algorithm. And then we required a computational infrastructure that was capable of processing all this data in a timely fashion so that we could take advantage of advances in our knowledge about the instrument and about the sky. Well, how does Kepler work? In this cartoon, essentially we have a planet that's crossing the face of the star, and I apologize that the media didn't transfer over. But you would see the silhouette of a planet crossing the face of the star. And all the stars that Kepler observes are typically 1,000 to 3,000 light years away. So we can't see the disk of the star. We can't see the silhouette of the planet crossing the disk. What we can do is we can measure the brightness of the star as a function of time, looking for instances when the planet crosses the face of the star and blocks a small amount of light that will last for typically several hours. On this next slide, I'll show you how hard it is to find good planets, which we want to find the solid planets that you or I could stand on. Those are the ones of most interest. Here's an image of the sun with a silhouette of a Jupiter-sized planet obscuring it. Jupiter is about 10 times smaller than the sun, and therefore, when it transits, it causes a 1% drop in brightness, as seen over here. This is some real Kepler data with a comparable drop in brightness. Here's a silhouette of an Earth-sized planet crossing a sun-sized star, and it's much smaller. It's about 10 times smaller still than Jupiter. And so it causes a percent drop in brightness, or roughly 100 parts per million. That's why we need a noise level of about 10 to 20 parts per million in order to reliably detect these signatures. And this is the first planet smaller than Earth discovered around another star. And it has a drop in brightness of about roughly 100 parts per million. So that's one major reason we have to go to space. You simply cannot achieve that level of precision from the ground. So in March of 2009, we launched the Kepler spacecraft to begin NASA's first search for Earth-sized planets in the habitable zone of sun-sized stars. And a month later, we collected this first light image. Now, this is a really big field of view. And imagine it's about the size of the palm of your hand held at arm's length. Now, compared to Hubble, which has a field of view about the size of a grain of sand, this is really big, over 100 square degrees. In fact, the full moon would fit into the gap between our CCD modules. So that gives you some idea of how big this field of view is. Now, there's certainly going to be other future spacecraft with even larger fields of view, but this was certainly novel for NASA to fly a mission like this. Well, one of the biggest problems we've had with the mission is keeping up with the data. It certainly was easy at first. We have about 64 gigabytes of data at the pixel level coming down each month. But over time, that builds up. Once we'd accumulated 4 years of data, to search each light curve for all the planets requires about 30 billion matches or statistical tests. And in order to keep up with all that data, it took quite a bit. Well, since I helped design and played a primary role in designing the science pipeline, I can't help but talk about it a little bit. So we have about 1 million lines of code that we've developed with 26 different modules, 5 of which are dedicated to processing the science data. So yes, we have to calibrate the pixels. This is some image data here. We get some light curves out. This is a planet in this light curve. We have to estimate the brightness or measure the brightness in each image. And then there are instrumental effects that have to be identified and removed from each of the light curves before it can be subjected to a transit search, which we do in this module over here, transiting planet search. Once we've identified transit-like features, we fit physical models to them, and we construct a suite of diagnostic tests that can make or break confidence in each of these transit-like features in terms of its planetary nature. Nevertheless, there's a lot of stuff that comes out of data validation that needs to be reviewed and vetted. And we have a threshold crossing event review team, which is people to review all of those events and then to decide which become planet candidates and which don't. That's such a huge task that we've been investigating machine learning approaches to leverage off of the wisdom of the people who've been doing it for the last 6 years to try to automate this part of the process. Now, in the closeout mission, because we're no longer taking data with Kepler, the goal of Kepler is to determine the frequency and distribution of planets, not just to find individual planets. To do that job, we need to understand the completeness and reliability of our planet-finding pipeline. So we've built in the capability to inject artificial transits and background eclipsing binaries, which can be confused as planets, into the data at the pixel level so that we can make a careful measurement of both of these quantities, and therefore develop robust estimates for the frequency and distribution of planets in the galaxy. While the search problem is very much like searching for a needle in a haystack, during the primary mission, what would happen is that we would have bales of hay falling on top of our heads every month. And like I said, it was very easy at first to keep up with the data, but after a while, it got harder and harder. And so about 2 years or so into the mission, we'd learned enough about the spacecraft and about the sky that we wanted to reprocess all the data. And it took us 10 months. And so by the time we got towards the end of the primary mission, we realized it would take us 2 years to reprocess all the data. So we began the task of porting all of our code to run on the supercomputer. And so at first, we just made all the code parallel so that instead of processing one 3-month segment of data at a time, we could process all of them all at once. And we found instances where the code was slower than it needed to be. When you're a cost cap mission, getting the job done to schedule is more important than getting the job done and having it be running really fast. So this is a picture of the architecture that we had that was local in terms of the clusters that we used. We had 700 CPUs and about 4 terabytes of RAM and about 200 terabytes of raw disk storage. We've since built this up and doubled it, but in the meantime, we've converted everything to run on the supercomputer. So in fact, here's the hyperwall with our search algorithm for planets running on it, displaying the results. And it has over 200,000 cores, about 700 terabytes of memory, and lots of storage. I want to switch topics just a little bit and talk about the machine learning approaches that we're using and developing for vetting the candidates, because it's a really big job. And so the idea is to try to train a machine to make the distinction between planet or not planet. And certainly during the mission, as we were going through, we were collecting much more data. We were getting a lot more transit-like signals coming out of the data, most of which were not real planets. And it felt a lot like Lucy in the Chocolate Factory, that more and more and more of these planet-like features would come by, would need to be reviewed and vetted. Here's a data validation summary. So this is a 1-page summary coming out of the pipeline for one planet. In fact, this is a planet, a very interesting planet that I'll talk to you a little bit about in just a little bit. But this 1-page summary sits on top of about 100 pages of the detailed diagnostics and plots. And so when we run our pipeline, if you took and printed out all of these data validation reports, the stack would be about 140 stories high. So I don't think anybody's ever tried to print out all of the data validation reports. I hope they never do. But you can imagine that there's no way that any human or group of humans can completely understand in Grok all of the information contained in all of those reports. So can we use machine learning to our advantage to try to make an effort at doing so? The distribution of the transit-like features, this is orbital period here. And you see that in both cases of a search through the first 3 years of data and a search through the 4 years of data that we accumulated eventually, that there's a huge peak near the orbital period of the spacecraft, which is very close to 1 year, 1 Earth year. And there's no astrophysical reason to believe that nature made lots of planets in 1 year period orbits. So most of these are trash. And that's really unfortunate because the most important planet for us to find is one that's small, rocky, and in an orbit that permits liquid water to pool on its surface. So if you're talking about a G2 star like the Sun, you're talking about an orbital period of about 1 year. So we have to sort through all that stuff. So one of the ways that we're doing that is by using a random forest algorithm. And these random forest algorithms, basically you build random decision trees on a random subset of the training data and a random subset of the attributes that you have to make the decision with for each node. These are pretty nice because they allow you to establish or measure the importance of each attribute. So maybe the humans aren't looking at all 200 quantities that come out of the search and data validation effort. Maybe there's 1 or 2 or 3 that they're missing that they really should be looking at. So it's nice to be able to attribute the importance to each attribute. Perhaps more importantly, you can take the voting record of all the trees in your forest and use them to score and then quantify the reliability of the classifications that have been made. So you build a lot of these. In our case, we build something on the order of 100,000 trees. And then you let them vote on the classification for each object. Now, these show the results of looking at the 4 years of data. The blue stars are the training data for planet candidates. And if everything were perfect, all the blue stars would be up in the upper right, because then all the trees would have voted for planet candidate status for all of these objects, which are largely strong planet candidates or confirmed or validated planets from the past. All the green objects are astrophysical false positives. These are the things that go bump in the night that we know why they should go bump in the night. Eclipsing binaries, background eclipsing binaries, those sorts of things. So these are Keplerian clocks, but they just happen not to be planets. And if everything were perfect, they would be down, all clustered in the lower right-hand side. The red X's are the duds, the banana peels that you don't want to slip on. And indeed, it's hard to see here, but there are an awful lot of them. And ideally, they would all be positioned in the lower left if everything went right. Well, how do we do? So this shows essentially the error rate. And we achieve a composite error rate of about 4% or so, which is actually really good. And that's, given the disagreements where the humans make disagreements, this is pretty good. So it's very promising to use machine learning approaches for this classification problem. And I'm really excited by the fact that then you can overlay a Bayesian classification scheme on top of this and essentially establish class posterior probabilities for each particular class that you have. And why this is important, why you want to measure the degree to which something is a planet, is that we're interested in calculating the occurrence rates of planets. For each planet we do discover, there are at least 200 others that we didn't even see. And our sensitivity isn't 100%, so there are probably a lot more than that. And so we need to know our sensitivity, our completeness, and reliability very well. But in the end, when you're talking about Earth-sized planets in the habitable zone of Sun-like stars, we aren't going to have a large sample of those. And so we're going to have to be at the hairy edges of the data. And that means that we have to have a reliability. Maybe this object should only be counted as 50% of a planet rather than 100%. We also want to make ourselves robust against decision errors, right? You don't want to have a ragged edge that drags your statistics all over the place because somebody decides that this object is in or this object is out. You want to make it robust. Well, one of the only samples we have of a small, possibly rocky planet in the habitable zone of a Sun-like star is Kepler 452b, and we announced this back in July, so just a couple of months ago. This is in a train of discoveries. So here's the Earth and the Sun up in the upper right. In December of 2011, with 2.5 years of data under our belts, we discovered Kepler 20e, and I showed you the light curve for that object earlier. It's somewhat smaller than the Earth, but it's in a very short orbital period, 6 days. So it's scorching hot. It can't hope to have an atmosphere, let alone a liquid water ocean on its surface. So we kept on searching. And in fact, in that self-same month, we announced the discovery of Kepler 22b. This is the first planet in the habitable zone of a G-type star, but it's over twice the size of the Earth, and therefore is unlikely to have a solid surface upon which you or I could walk. So it may indeed be a water world, but we kept on collecting data. And indeed, just over a year ago, we announced the discovery of Kepler 186f, which is the first near-Earth-sized planet in the habitable zone of a small, cool M-dwarf star, a red dwarf, that's about half the size and half the mass of our own sun. And that's indeed very exciting. But a couple of months ago, in July, we announced the discovery of Kepler 452b, which is the first small, possibly rocky planet in the habitable zone of a G2 star like our own sun. To put this discovery into context, I'm showing the 186 system alongside of Kepler 52 in our own solar system. And you'll note that the green shaded region indicates the habitable zone, that range of distances from a star for which liquid water could pool on the surface of a rocky planet. And all of the planets in the Kepler 186 system, including the outermost 186f, this habitable world, they lie within the orbit of Mercury in our own system. So it's very important what kind of star that you orbit in terms of how far you are. Kepler 186 is a compact solar system. That's very interesting. But the habitable zone, the size and extent of that for 452 is nearly the same as that of our own sun. And indeed, the orbital size for 452b is nearly the same size as the orbit of our own Earth. So this is the closest we've gotten to finding a Sun-Earth analog. Because the stars are so similar, 452 and our own sun, we can look at the evolution history of the habitability of this planet in terms of the energy it receives from its star over time, measured in billions of years. The current age that we estimate for 452 and for 452b, the planet, is about 6 billion years. Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. So both stars become brighter as they grow and evolve over time. And so at this point in time, 452b is receiving 10% more radiation than we are today from the sun. But 1.5 billion years ago, we were receiving the same amount of radiation. So in fact, this planet, because it's a little bit farther from its star, received no more radiation than the Earth does today over the first 5 billion years of its history. And that's a lot of time and opportunity for life to arise if all the necessary ingredients and conditions do exist for that on this planet. Both Earth and 452b will continue to evolve out of the habitable zone over time as the stars grow and evolve and get brighter. But we've got a lot of time to decide where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. Fortunately, I won't go to 452b. It's 1,400 light years away. Surely there are other planets much closer. At any rate, so this is a plot of all of the small habitable zone planets that have been found by Kepler over the last 6 years. They're all under twice the size of Earth. The size of the disk is scaled relative to the image of Earth up here. And they're oriented with respect to the surface temperature of the star that they orbit. And the energy received is in Earth units. And again, the green shaded regions indicate either the conservative habitable zone or the optimistic habitable zone, respectively. But the thing to note here is that until 452b came on the scene, all of the other 11 planets that have been discovered like this have been discovered orbiting stars that are significantly cooler and smaller than our own sun, or somewhat cooler and somewhat smaller than our own sun. So we have about 4 that we've detected around M stars, these small, cool red dwarfs, and about 7 that have been detected around K dwarfs, which are somewhat cooler, but can be significantly smaller than the sun. So far, this is the only example we have of a small, possibly rocky planet orbiting a G-type star. In fact, a G2-type star very similar to our own sun. So with that, I'd like to close my talk. We know of 2,000, roughly, planets orbiting other stars. It's quite amazing to see all this happen in the space of just 20 years. It's just really amazing to see all the technology being achieved, and then to look forward to the characterization of the atmospheres of these planets and the search for biosignatures in the atmospheres. So now that we know that there are a lot of habitable worlds, the job is to go and find the inhabited worlds, and that's in the future. But it has involved a lot of serious data challenges, and it's really stretched all of our talents with respect to the image processing, signal processing, and managing all this data. And I look forward very much to all of these other missions to come. Thank you very much.